Good morning, ninth graders, and it is morning. I decided to get a little early start this morning, so let me see. It's about 7:30, and have my coffee right here. Yes, yummy. And I'm ready to read. I'm ready to read. You know, it's really important that you continue to read and that you are keeping up with your online assignments and your expectations from all of your collegiate leaders. I want all of you to be in 10th grade next year, no matter how the school ends. I know there are so many seniors right now in high schools across North Carolina and the nation that are concerned about graduating and moving on and going to college. I don't want you to be feeling that anxiety. I want you to do what you need to do and get the job done so that you can be in 10th grade next year. We're reading Into the Clouds, and we are at chapter 4, How Small Indeed. I find this book fascinating, especially considering the time period. Um, Without the technology, without so many of the devices that we have access to today, that these men undertook this expedition. So here we go, page 34. The team started up the ridge on July 3rd. They attacked each segment of the climb with the same repeating rhythm. 2 climbers went ahead to find the next campsite. The rest ferried loads of supplies up from the lower camps. While the supplies arrived, 2 more strapped on crampons and clawed out another foothold, 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet higher. Each segment had its own way of reminding them that no one had ever before set foot where they were climbing. To establish Camp 3, Petzolds and House had to carve steps into vicious ice slopes that dropped off more than 4,000 feet to the glacier beneath. They put Petzolds, Titans, to work, hammering them into exposed rock wherever they could. When Houston followed, he had 900 feet of rope to keep him secure to the mountainside. To the amusement of his climbing partners, he was starting to lose the running debate with Petzolds over climbing style, but he still referred to the Titans scornfully as ironware. Camp 3 was a meager ledge with nothing to protect it from the elements. Kukuli and the rest of the Sherpas had to gather rocks and build a 4-foot wall to make a platform level enough for the tents. Even then, the climbers went to bed worried that if they rolled over in the night, they could launch themselves down the mountainside, wrapped in a tent. On July 12th, Houston and Petzold set off to carry supplies to Camp 4. As they dug for footholds, they discovered one of K2's most dangerous defenses. The slope was covered in loose rock. No matter how carefully they chose their route, they seemed to dislodge half the mountainside. All day long, they sent a haul of rocks clattering down on their comrades in Camp 3. In the afternoon, Houston and Petzold climbed back into camp after dropping their loads at Camp 4. They offered up a cheery greeting and got nothing but cold stares in return. 3 tents had been ripped, and their inhabitants were shell-shocked from dodging rocks all morning. It was a tense moment at 20,700 feet. Houston and Petzold had put in a day of hard work and got no thanks for it. The rest of the team felt their lives had been put in danger by their 2 careless teammates. Houston and Petzold decided not to plead their case. Instead, they dug through the supplies and emerged with jam, dates, and hot tea for everyone. Before long, they were all laughing in the faded light, ready to take shelter in their newly ventilated tents and prepare to climb another day. The next morning, though, Houston lay in his sleeping bag for what seemed like hours. All night he had dreamed of New Hampshire and New York. Now he just wanted to be done with the mountain so he'd get home and sleep in a warm bed. Dreading day's work and wishing job were done, he wrote, hated idea of going on. This is a photograph. Bates using fixed ropes to guide him through a traverse between camps 2 and 3. And yeah, it looks so simple right there, but you think about it, they're at 20,700 feet. think the highest mountain that I'll call it climbed, is the Sandia Mountains in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they're just over 12,000 feet. Probably been higher than that, but not at the very top. So I'm thinking about, this is another 8,000 feet in very rugged ice-covered terrain. So it's mind-boggling. Above Camp 4 lay the most treacherous terrain yet. Bates and House reached it on July 14th, an 80-foot wall of rock, nearly vertical, with a single crack slanting up the length of the cliff. At sea level, the cliff would have been challenging even for an experienced climber. High on the face of K2, it looked nearly impossible. But there was no way around it. And if anyone could climb it, Bill House was the man. Bates found an outcropping of rock at the base of the cliff and tied himself to it. Then he ran the rope that connected him to House around the rock to create friction. In the language of climbers used to talk about their craft, this is what's known as a belay, a system of ropes and anchors that allows one climber to protect another from falling. Bates' position was as good as he could make it. But as House climbed higher, the belay would give him less and less protection. If he slipped, he would fall twice the distance between himself and Bates before the rope went taut and stopped him from careening down to the glacier. House began edging his way up the crack, finding tiny ridges in the rock face, just big enough for fingers or the edge of a boot. He pressed hard against the sides for leverage. About 20 feet up, the crack widened, and he had to stretch too far for holds. So he wriggled into position with his back against one side of the crack, and the soles of his boots weighed against the other side. Little by little, he inched higher. The crack narrowed, and House could again rely on tiny holds. It was grueling work, and he paused often to grasp for air. But the cliff gave him no real rest. Every second he spent clinging to the rock brought his forearms and shoulders that much closer to giving out. About 40 feet above Bates, House found a ledge wide enough to take the pressure off his limbs. At this point, he was exhausted and close to his limit. If he fell from here, he would plunge 40 feet down the cliff and another 40 feet down an ice slope. The fall might not kill him, but it was unlikely he would escape without broken bones. This high on the mountain, he might as well be dead. House pulled out a python. He thought he saw a tiny crack big enough to pound the metal spike into. If he could secure it in the rock face, he could run his rope through the end to give him protection much higher on the cliff. But the python dug a half-inch into the rock and then crumbled like a weak nail. He looked down at Bates, who hadn't been able to move since House started to climb. Bates was freezing, and he yelled up, hoping to convince House to come down. House wasn't sure how much strength he had left, but the climb down looked even more harrowing than what lay above him. He shouted a quick, "No thanks," and clawed his way upward. Finally, he pulled himself over the lip of the cliff and lay panting at the top. It had taken him more than an hour to climb 80 feet, but his accomplishment would be talked about for decades to come. The cliff is one of the hardest climbs in high altitude mountaineering, and he had done it with the only promise of protection coming from 80 feet below. The tiny crack high on the face of K2 would become known as House's Chimney. So this is the route that they followed. And you could see where they put their various camps along the way. This is something we should come back and refer to as we're reading, because now this is what we just finished reading about, House's Chimney. That's what came to be called House's Chimney, because it was like climbing straight up, but in ice and snow-covered terrain. 3 days later, everyone was safe at Camp 5 at the top of the chimney, where a vicious storm rolled in. Houston didn't want to wait it out. On the mountain, he had a never-ending supply of cheerful, nervous energy. It seemed as though he never stopped moving. Impatient to make progress, he and Petzolds suited up the morning of July 17th and headed out to place the next camp. The wind hit them like a freight train. Their beards frosted over, hands and feet went numb. In minutes, they turned back for the shelter of the tents. Kukuli greeted them with tea. Just like Nanga Parbat, he said ominously. The 1934 disaster in Nanga Parbat still haunted Kukuli. The German leaders of the expedition had made a furious push for the summit without taking time to stock the high camps with supplies. They made it to 24,500 feet before a raging blizzard shrouded the mountain. With no place to wait out the storm, 16 men had to fight their way down through blinding snow and winds strong enough to lift a 160-pound climber into the air. Kukuli spent 3 nights exposed on the mountain before stumbling to safety, snow-blind and frostbitten. 3 German climbers and 6 Sherpas weren't so lucky. They froze or starved to death on the side of Nanga Parbat. It was a story of bitter, prolonged agony, and every climber knew it well. Now, 22,000 feet up the slopes of K2, it was not a thought anyone wanted to dwell on. In contrast to the German expedition, Houston had made sure every camp on K2 was well stocked. If the storm lasted, they could huddle at Camp 5 for 10 days before they ran out of food. But after 5 weeks on the mountain, the cold, the altitude, and the simple, relentless hardship was starting to take its toll. It had been months since they had slept on a mattress, sat at a table, or eaten a fresh vegetable. For 2 weeks, they hadn't stood on level ground, put boots, cups, or bowls down carelessly, and they went clattering into the abyss. Walk around unroped and inattentive, and you could easily follow. Everything required effort, and at times it seemed too much to bear. In the mornings, they forced themselves out of their sleeping bags by letting the air out of their mattresses while they lay in the tent. When rocks poked them in the back, they got up and started the day. A supply of mail had made it up from base camp on July 15th. To House, the letters were almost too painful to read. He had gotten used to the frozen boots and damp socks, the frost on the tent melting onto his head every morning. He could stand it as long as he had nothing to compare it to. But the thought of everyone he loved going to sleep at night in soft beds and warm houses was enough to drive him crazy. Okay, we're going to stop there, page 42. If you have some time over the weekend, read on. I'm really excited to see what's happening next. And I hope you have a good weekend. Again, thanks so much for joining in Into the Clouds. Have a good weekend, Ninth graders.